So this is this document, this is the report, which was published by the General Assembly of United Nations. The date you can see here is 12th August 1992. Okay, United Nations General Assembly, report of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, Rio de Janeiro, 3rd to 14th June 1992. Okay, so this is this Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, having met at Rio de Janeiro from 3rd to 14th June 1992. Reaffirming the Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment adopted at Stockholm on 16 June 1972 and seeking to build upon it with the goal of establishing a new and equitable global partnership through the creation of new levels of cooperation among states, key sectors of societies and people, working towards international agreements which respect the interests of all and protect the integrity of the global environmental and developmental system. Recognizing the integral and interdependent nature of the earth, our home, proclaims that, now you see the principle 1, human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Principle 2, states have, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental and developmental policies, and the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Principle 3, the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. Principle 4, in order to achieve sustainable development, environmental protection shall constitute an integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation from it. Principle 5, all states and all people shall cooperate in the essential task of eradicating poverty as an indispensable requirement for sustainable development in order to decrease the disparities in standards of living and better meet the needs of the majority of the people of the world. Principle 6, the special situation and needs of developing countries, particularly the least developed and those most environmentally vulnerable, shall be given special priority. International actions in the field of environment and development should also address the interests and needs of all countries. Principle 7, states shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem. In view of the different contributions to global environmental degradation, states have common but differentiated responsibilities. The developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technologies and financial resources they command. Principle 8, to achieve sustainable development and a higher quality of life for all people, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and promote appropriate demographic policies. Principle 9, states should cooperate to strengthen indigenous capacity building for sustainable development by improving scientific understanding through exchanges of scientific and technological knowledge and by enhancing the development, adaptation, diffusion and transfer of technologies including new and innovative technologies. Principle 10, environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. At the national level, each individual shall have appropriate access to information concerning the hazardous materials and activities in their communities and the opportunity to participate in decision-making process. States shall facilitate and encourage public awareness and participation by making information widely available. Effective access to judicial and administrative proceedings, including redress and remedy, shall be provided. Principle 11, states shall enact effective environmental legislation. Environmental standards, management objectives and priorities should reflect the environmental and developmental context which they apply. Standards applied by some countries may be inappropriate and of unwarranted economic and social cost to other countries, in particular developing countries. Principle 12. States should cooperate to promote a supportive and open international economic system that will lead to economic growth and sustainable development in all countries. To better address the problems of environmental degradation, trade policy measures for environmental purposes should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. Unilateral action to deal with environmental challenges outside the jurisdiction of the importing country should be avoided. Environmental measures addressing transboundary or global environmental problems should, as far as possible, be based on an international consensus. Principle 13. States shall develop national law regarding liability and compensation for the victims of pollution and other environmental damage. States shall also cooperate in an expeditious and more determined manner to develop further international law regarding liability and compensation for adverse effects of environmental damage caused by activities within their jurisdiction or control to areas beyond their jurisdiction. Principle 14. States should effectively cooperate to discourage or prevent the relocation and transfer to other states of any activities and substances that cause severe environmental degradation or are found to be harmful to human health. Principle 15. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Principle 16. National authorities should endeavor to promote the internationalization of environmental costs and the use of economic instruments, taking into account the approach that the polluter should in principle bear the cost of pollution, with due regard to the public interest and without distorting international trade and investment. Principle 17. Environmental impact assessment as a national instrument shall be undertaken for proposed activities that are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment and are subject to a decision of a competent national authority. Principle 18. States shall immediately notify other states of any natural disasters or other emergencies that are likely to produce sudden harmful effect on the environment of those states. Every effort shall be made by the international community to help states to so afflicted. Principle 19. States shall provide prior and timely notification and relevant information to potentially affected states or activities that may have a significant adverse transboundary environmental effect and shall consult with those states at an early stage and in good faith. Principle 20th. Women have a vital role in environmental management and development. Their full participation is therefore essential to achieve sustainable development. Principle 21. The creativity, ideals and courage of the youth of the world should be mobilized to forge a global partnership in order to achieve sustainable development and ensure a better future for all. Principle 22. Indigenous people and their communities and other local communities have a vital role in environmental management and development because of their knowledge and traditional practices. States should recognize and duly support their identity, culture and interests and enable their effective participation in the achievement of sustainable development. Principle 23. The environment and natural resources of people under oppression, domination and occupation shall be protected. Principle 24. Warfare is inherently destructive of sustainable development. States shall therefore respect international law, providing protection for the environment in times of armed conflict and cooperate in its further development as necessary. Principle 25. Peace, development and environmental protection are interdependent and indivisible. Principle 26. States shall resolve all their environmental disputes peacefully and by appropriate means in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Principle 27. States and people shall cooperate in good faith and in spirit of partnership in the fulfillment of the principles embodied in this declaration and in the further development of international law in the field of sustainable development. A report of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, Stockholm, 5 to 16 June 1972. United Nations publication, Cells, this and this. So this is like a document, Rio Declaration document, which comprehensively gives you, like these principles which were adopted and ratified, by General Assembly, during, like this time. Okay, so with this, we are closing the unit 1. We'll move on to the next unit. Yeah, so in this second unit, we will see about UNFCCC. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change established an international environmental treaty to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system, in part by stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So with this preamble, actually this started functioning and many more things, right? So what is it for actually? The UNFCCC entered into force on 21 March 1994. Today it has near universal membership. The 198 countries that have ratified the convention are called parties to the convention. Preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system is the ultimate aim of the UNFCCC. So preventing this thing, like a dangerous human interference with the climate systems. Like we know, like Earth has, like a certain, like a climatic pattern, climatic system. But with the, anthropocenic, like activities and, like so much of impact, this has come to a very, like a bad, like a stage, right? And which is causing global, like imbalances. So this is what actually this convention is meant to do, is to save, like the globe, slave, the climatic system, from dangerous human interferences. So first steps to a safer future, the convention in summary. So let's see like what this convention actually does. So the convention recognized that there was a problem. First and foremost thing, this was remarkable for its time. Remember in 1994, when the UNFCCC took effect, there was less scientific evidence than there is now. The UNFCCC borrowed a very important line from one of the most successful multilateral environmental treaties in history, the Montreal Protocol in 1987. It bound member states to act in the interests of human safety, even in the face of scientific uncertainty. So, like we are sitting in year 2023, and now there are so many organizations, governments, independent agencies, which are conducting research, and there are scientific evidences. But in these early years, when this whole concept was under formulation, these summits were being done for the first time, and right, everybody at the global level perhaps was looking at it for the first time, right? So it was very kind of a challenging for these organizations and these conventions to establish like what they are talking about, has a substantial a weight behind it, and this is what needs to be done, right? So but anyhow, this convention actually started, and the first very important foundational argument they found was from this Montreal Protocol, okay, and it bound actually member states to act in the interest of human safety, even in the face of scientific uncertainty. Even if there is no scientific impact, but there is some a direct threat to the human society, to the planet, okay, that must be actually saved, right? The convention sets a lofty but specific goal. The ultimate objective of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, including humans included. It states that such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to the climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. How do we know what is dangerous anthropogenic interference? Okay, we'll see. So maybe you can search for it separately, right? That will be an interesting study material for you. The convention puts the onus on developed countries to lead the way. The idea is that as they are the source of most past and current greenhouse gas emissions, industrialized countries are expected to do the most to cut emissions on home ground. They are called Annex 1 countries and belong to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. They include 12 countries with economies in transition from Central and Eastern Europe, Annex 1 countries were expected by the year 2000 to reduce emissions to 1990 levels. Many of them have taken strong action to do so, and some have already succeeded. Right. So, well, like if you see, like usually we call like humans are responsible, for this whole like a mess and all that. But with humans, this term actually represents like all humans, right? All human and all members of like which are from a human species, right? They all actually come into this like this thing. But it is definitely not like every human has contributed in the same ratio, right? Similarly, every country also has not contributed in the same ratio to this whole mess. There are a selected few who have done like the worst like performances over like several decades, perhaps a century. That has led to this situation. So with this actually convention, it was brought like those who are mainly responsible must do more and more to save on to this thing, which makes definitely like a full sense, right? So that's how this whole thing was actually formulated, and these OECD countries, mainly 12 countries, they were actually brought onto this like this discussion, right? So what compelled these countries to act? Maybe you can look for it. The convention directs new funds to climate change activities in developing countries. Industrialized nations agree under the convention to support climate change activities in developing countries by providing financial support for action on climate change. Above and beyond any financial assistance they already provide to these countries, a system of grants and loans have been set up through the convention and is managed by the Global Environment Facility. Industrialized countries also agree to share technology with less advanced nations. So you may be knowing like like LDCs, low developing like countries, of course they are fighting for meeting the very basic needs: food, health, nutrition, education, all of those things, right? So they of course do not have the capacity to like bring like a lot of or sudden changes, like a technological change and other economic changes, right? So the onus was actually given to these like developed countries to help LDCs and other developing countries to meet their own like evolution in terms of technological and infrastructural and things like that, right? Further, the convention keeps tab on the problem and what's being done about it. Industrialized countries, Annex 1, have to report regularly on their climate change policies and measures, including issues governed by the Kyoto Protocol. They must also submit an annual inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions, including data for their year base 1990 and all the years since. Okay, so you see like how these checks and measures like came into the practice, right? So they must actually like talk about and share their policies and measures what they have taken over the years, plus they have to share like their annual greenhouse gas emissions data also compared to the like a base year 1990, whether it is increasing or decreasing, so that a check can be kept. Developing countries, non-Annex 1 parties, report in more general terms on their actions, both to address climate change and to adapt to its impacts, but less regularly than Annex 1 parties do. And their reporting is contingent on their getting funding for the preparation of the reports, particularly in the case of the least developed countries. The convention charts the beginning of a path to strike a delicate balance. Economic development is particularly vital to the world's poorer countries. Such progress is difficult to achieve even without the complications added by climate change. The convention takes this into consideration by accepting that the share of greenhouse gas emissions produced by developing nations will grow in the coming years. Nonetheless, in the interest of fulfilling its ultimate goal, it seeks to help such countries limit emissions in ways that will not hinder their economic progress. One such win-win solution was to emerge later when the Kyoto Protocol to the convention was conceived. The convention kicks off formal consideration of adaptation to climate change. The convention acknowledges the vulnerability of all countries to the effects of climate change and calls for special efforts to ease the consequences, especially in developing countries which lack the resources to do so on their own. In the early years of the convention, adaptation received less attention than mitigation, as parties wanted more certainty on impacts of and vulnerability to climate change. When IPCC's third assessment report was released, adaptation gained traction and parties agreed on a process to address adverse effects and so to establish funding arrangements for adaptation. Currently, work on adaptation takes place under different convention bodies. The Adaptation Committee, which parties agreed to set up under the Cancun adaptation framework as part of the Cancun agreement, is a major step towards a cohesive convention-based approach to adaptation. So, how adaptation also came into the practice and how it was kept as a check and measure, by formulating these conventions and different bodies, that kind of things started actually taking shape, more concretized, effort towards SD. UNFCCC and the Rio Convention. The UNFCCC is a Rio Convention, one of the two opened for signature at the Rio Earth Summit. You remember in the last unit, I explained in 1992. Its sister Rio Conventions are the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification. The three are intrinsically linked. It is in this context that the Joint Liaison Group was set up to boost cooperation among the three conventions, with the ultimate aim of developing synergies in their activities on issues of mutual concern. So, next unit we are seeing is about Kyoto Protocol, which happened in 1995. The Kyoto Protocol operationalizes the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by committing industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gases (GHGs) emissions in accordance with the agreed individual targets. So, the aim and objective of Kyoto Protocol is very clear. Okay, to control GHGs and individualized target for each and every country, based on their emissions. Well, what is it? What is Kyoto Protocol? The Kyoto Protocol was adopted on 11 December 1997. Owing to a complex ratification process, it entered into force on 16 February 2005. Currently, there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. In short, the Kyoto Protocol operationalizes the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by committing industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with agreed individual targets. The convention itself only asks those countries to adopt policies and measures on mitigation and to those report periodically. The Kyoto Protocol is based on the principles and provisions of the convention and follows its annex-based structure. It only binds developed countries and places a heavier burden on them under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, because it recognizes that they are largely responsible for the current high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere. So, if you see common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So, very pinpointedly, identifying, those countries which are main culprits and then going behind them for the rectification. In its Annex B, the Kyoto Protocol sets binding emission reduction targets for 37 industrialized countries and economies in transition and the European Union. Overall, these targets add up to an average 5% emission reduction compared to 1990 level over the 5 years period 2008 to 2012. This was the period, the first commitment periods. Doha Amendment into this. In Doha, Qatar, on 8 December 2012, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was adopted for a second commitment period starting in 2013 and lasting until 2020. As of 28 October 2020, 147 parties deposited their instrument of acceptance. Therefore, the threshold of 144 instruments of acceptance for entry into force of the Doha Amendment was achieved. The amendment entered into force on 31 December 2020. The amendment includes new commitments for Annex 1 parties to the Kyoto Protocol who agreed to take on commitments in a second commitment period from 1 January 2013 to 31 December 2020. A revised list of GHG to be reported on by parties in the second commitment period, and amendments to several articles of the Kyoto Protocol which specifically referenced issues pertaining to the first commitment period and which needed to be updated for the second commitment period. On 21 December 2012, the amendment was circulated by the Secretary General of the United Nations, acting in his capacity as depository to all parties to the Kyoto Protocol in accordance with Article 20 and 21 of the Protocol. During the first commitment period, 37 industrialized countries and economies in transition and the European Community committed to reduce GHG emissions to an average of 5% against 1990 levels. During the second commitment period, the parties committed to reduce GHG emission by at least 18% below 1990 levels in the 8-year period from 2013 to 20. However, the composition of parties in the second commitment period is different from the first. So maybe you can have a look on that. These are two pictures, from this summit. You see this grand hall in Kyoto at the dais, some dignitaries sitting. So the Kyoto mechanisms. One important element of the Kyoto Protocol was the establishment of flexible market mechanisms which are based on the trade of emission permits. Under the protocol, countries must meet their targets primarily through national measures. However, the protocol also offers them as an additional means to meet their targets by the way of three market-based mechanisms: international emissions trading, clean development mechanism, and joint implementation. Well, monitoring emission targets. The Kyoto Protocol also established a rigorous monitoring, review and verification system as well as a compliance system to ensure transparency and hold parties to account. Under the protocol, countries' actual emissions have to be monitored and precise records have to be kept of the trades carried out. So if you see, this was one serious attempt in checking the emission of GHGs by the major economies which were majorly responsible for it. Okay, because then only if you go with the a clear mindset and a very iron fist and approach, then only it is possible to control. Otherwise, nobody bothers. Because sustainability and all of these issues are not one person's problem; it's a common problem, and this is also one of the drawbacks that no one cares about. Right? It needs to be dealt with in such a fashion that everyone who is responsible must be brought to the accountability. Registry systems. It tracks and records transactions by parties under the mechanisms. The UN Climate Change Secretariat, based in Bonn, Germany, keeps an international transaction log to verify that transactions are consistent with the rules of the protocol. Reporting is done by parties by submitting annual emission inventories and national reports under the protocol at regular intervals. A compliance system ensures that parties are meeting their commitments and helps them to meet their commitments if they have problems doing so. Adaptation. The Kyoto Protocol, like the Convention, is also designed to assist countries in adapting to the adverse effects of climate change. It facilitates the development and deployment of technologies that can help increase resilience to the impacts of climate change. The Adaptation Fund was established to finance adaptation projects and programs in developing countries that are parties to the Kyoto Protocol. In the first commitment period, the fund was financed mainly with a share of proceeds from the CDM project activities. In Doha in 2012, it was decided that for the second commitment period, international emissions trading and joint implementation would also provide the adaptation fund with a 2% share of proceeds. So you see how the funding was also arranged, is worked out based on these analysis. So we will see about this Kyoto Protocol, and we will see it's in detail.